I first attended a UU church in 1986. And in the Sunday bulletin, I found words like this. When you hear the word God, it means the highest ideal or aspiration a person may have. We understand that it is called by many names by many people. The word God is used as a shorthand. You have the right to define it as you wish. As a seminarian slipping off the liberal edge of Christianity, I saw these words as liberating. Later, the minister was fired, and I learned in the coffee hour scuttle that the phrase was included in the order of service because most people in the congregation really objected to the use of the word God, and the former minister used the word too often. Instead of a welcome for a liberal Christian, it was a warning for the humanists. The next church I attended was in Kenosha, Wisconsin, and they had a half-time minister, and she also worked half-time at the church in Mukwonago. The Kenosha church told me she was more Christian than they liked, but they tolerated that because her sermons were interesting and she was open to other beliefs and was a good pastor. We lost her when the Mukwonago church fired her for not being Christian enough. She gave up on Unitarian Universalists and became a full-time Methodist minister. When I was in Winston-Salem during their 50th anniversary celebration, I came across a newsletter article where the congregant said he would walk out of the service if ever a prayer was uttered. He suggested that a warning be put in the newsletter so he could avoid disrupting the service. Now, he was an activist. He was a humanist activist. He had done much more riskier protests. He had been on the Freedom Rides and had been the person who led this congregation during the Civil Rights era. He accepted all humanity, but rejected all religion. In the 60s and 70s and into the 80s, Unitarian Universalism was overwhelmingly humanist. There were jokes such as Unitarian means that they believe in one God at most, and that Unitarian Universalism was church for atheists with children. The UUs of that day were an oppressed religious minority. Ed Wilson, who was a minister here, was a champion for that minority. And they were wary of anyone who used the language of the oppressor. But as an oppressed people, they were sympathetic to other oppressed people, and thus active in civil rights. And our humanist congregations in the 70s and 80s became a haven for ministers who were denied a mainstream Christian pulpit. We welcomed liberal Christians, women, gays, and lesbians into our congregations. The leadership of these ministers helped us grow. We moved from our adolescent defensiveness of trying to be anything but our parents' religion, and we became generally more open to a variety of spiritualities, opening the doors not only to Christians, but also to paganism. There's a congregational divide, a generational divide in our congregations. Those over 60 tend to be atheists, agnostic, skeptic. Those from 30 to 60 are more likely to be theists. They believe in some sort of higher power. They've been exposed to Eastern religions, and they reserve the right to create their own spirituality. So I want to see if the demographics of this church match national demographics. So if you are over 60, or let's say over 55, why don't you stand up, or if it's difficult to stand, raise both hands. So, if you tend to be a doubter or a believer, I'm going to ask those who tend to be doubters, raise their hand.
I'm not sure what that means.
Okay, well, I could go through all sorts of different theologies, but the idea is if you believe in a God, however you define it, and it may be an unorthodox definition, I would put you on the tend towards believing, or you're at least seeking belief. But if you tend towards doubt, or you are darn certain that there is no God, raise your hand. So just figure out whether you are a doubter or a believer. So the doubters.
I'm an atheist.
These are broad categories. So those of you in the middle might have trouble knowing which side. You might go on both sides. And those who tend towards some sort of belief, raise your hand. And so we were looking at, we were slightly more humanist, but we had quite a few believers in our thing. It's probably a Midwestern thing. Okay, you can sit down. Now our boomers, those who are 35 to 55. If you can kind of stand up there, and boomers and young X's, yeah. Okay, so if you tend to be a skeptic about divinity, raise your hand.
Sorry again?
A skeptic about divinity, not too sure, pretty much certain that there is no divineness thing. So if you're that way, raise your hand. Okay. And then if you tend towards believing in something, raise your hand. Now they're a little bit more even than the older generation, which would be expected. Now, our next group of people, those under 35, the younger millennial, younger X's, and okay. Yeah. Well, this is probably the best thing that I've seen in a long time in a UU church. Okay, so how many of you tend towards skepticism? Okay. How many of you tend towards belief? Yeah. So that group again had both people represented, but was tilted a little bit heavier towards the humanist side. And so please sit down. So that speaks to a general trend that is going on, that younger people who have no religious affiliation are fully a quarter of those surveyed, and then amongst those, probably about half of them are either agnostic or atheists or some other form of other, and then half are maybe Buddhist or Hindu or some other religion besides Christianity, as those populations have grown in the last 30 years in our country. So the interesting thing is that in speaking in broad generalizations, and all of us can be exceptions to rules, that theologically, those 55 and older are more likely to be in agreement with the younger generation, those under 35. So there's a theological understanding there, but there is a big sociological difference. The older generation were joiners. They joined churches, they had Kiwanis Club, Moose Club, different PTA, all these things. The boomers inherited these traditions and institutions, but were darn sure that they had to change. And so they did everything to change them, and of course there was lots of conflict and contest and all this as this change was going on. And the younger generation, watching their parents argue with their grandparents about what an institution is, said, maybe it's institutions themselves that we just don't like. There's a more free-flowing world, that our lonely humanists who were here in the 50s were just glad to find one other person who believed like they would, and they would just so desperately needed to be in a house with 6 people that they could speak freely with, because that was a blessing. It was to know that they weren't alone in their doubts. Well, our children have found doubters all over the world. My son likes to play World of Warcraft on European time. He just kind of likes those people better. So he's out, and so it's like, that's just a whole different world. That the idea of how can I find somebody who is like me? Well, it's on my desktop. It's on my phone. It's just so immediately available. So the natural kind of, I need to find my tribe, is not there that was there 50 years ago. And so we have to start thinking of different ways of doing church in an age where membership, enrollment, how big is your church? Well, the answer to that question is, we have this many people on the rolls, or this many pledgers. And we have to start thinking differently about how we do church, not in who is in the in-group, but start, sadly, it's going to sound horrible, to be like McDonald's. Start counting how many served. But we're not serving burgers, we're serving people, and we're saying, what is church? I went to church. Well, when you say I went to church, people think, I went on Sunday morning and did some singing and heard a guy talk for too long. That church, we have to start thinking of all the ways that we are church. We have a very active adult education program. Those people who come may not be members, but they come repeatedly, and they are members of our community. They are people that we serve. The forum, half of the forum does not come to Sunday service, but they are members of the church. In fact, they are many of them founding members of this church, and those of us who are doing church owe a great debt to those who aren't too churchy. They like a good lecture, good discussion, and some coffee. And we have our social action group. And so the idea that Denise had her group that was singing, that had at the Take Back the Night event in Purdue. And most of her group were UUs, but there was at least 1 or 2 that were not signed members of our book. But they are people we serve by offering her a place to do this ministry, and then going out and doing that ministry, where I saw one of our members among that group, but there was a bunch of college students who weren't, who then invited Gail and I to come to a open mic that we weren't able to go to. But the sense of, we were serving Purdue. They are part of who we are. So it's got to be expanding the notion of not who is in the in-group, but who we serve. And that's going to be a big transformation of how we count in how we see how big we are. And just like the internet, we have to find new ways to monetize our ministry, because the system of collecting people and then collecting money from those people is not a business model that's working for anybody now. The brick and mortar stores, the Moose Club and bowling leagues all have fewer things. Bowling alleys have fewer leagues and more free nights of open bowling. They had to change their model of how they did bowling alleys. So that's the type of thing. We are serving a generation that demographically is coming more in line with who we have been as Unitarian Universalists for 50 years. So when you look around at the founders of this church, look at them and know that they were 50 years ahead of their time. And you look around at that wonderful large group of younger people who, I don't know why they were sitting in the back, but that might be another sociological study. They have found this place. And that if I was purely going to give you a marketing sermon, I would say to be on the cutting edge of making this a growing institution, we should chuck spirituality and go straight to humanism all the time, because that's where the trend of the world is going. And we could kind of position ourselves to just welcome all the disenfranchised and just take off. But that is not Unitarian Universalism. We are not a religion for the easy, because our job is not just to grow in numbers, but to grow in quality. And so we're going to be facing a world that is more multicultural, more multi-faith, more multi-versions of non-faith, so that we, instead of going to the growing edge and trying to profit from that, need to do hard work of showing the world how it can be. This is the place. People say, why is there so much dissension in the world? Why can't we just get along? Well, we can't, because it takes work. But I look in this room and I see Hindus, Muslims, Jews, Christians, atheists, crazy pantheists, transcendentalists like myself, all this different variety. We're inspired by so many things. But instead of segregating ourselves into looking for a like-minded group, which was absolutely necessary for the atheists in the 50s, we are now strong enough to be a model for the world. We have been through generations of change and discussion. We have had the discussions that other people are only now beginning. And that's who we need to be. The people who welcome everybody and fully aware of the hard work it takes, but willing to do it because they have faith in humanity and maybe something more. May we bless and be blessed.